Previously, on the 6th of September 1942, Lopatin had ordered both the 23rd Tank Corps and the 399th Rifle Division to withdraw slightly to better positions. And Yeremenko had reacted by saying that Lopatin had violated Order No. 227, the not a step back order. Well, this incident was used as the excuse to get rid of 62nd Army's commander. The sources vary on the timing, but one source says that Lopatin was arrested on the 6th of September, while another says Yeremenko asked Stalin to dismiss Lopatin on the 7th, which Stalin did on the 8th. You'd think Yeremenko would get Stalin's permission first before he arrested Lopatin, but it could have happened the other way around. Either way, from the 8th of September, nobody was in command of the 62nd Army, except for Krylov, the army's chief of staff. It's clear though that this minor withdrawal was just the excuse Yeremenko needed to get rid of Lopatin as commander of the 62nd Army. Bearing in mind that Shumilov had just retreated huge portions of his army back, as had Lopatin, and other commanders had made similar decisions to withdraw as well, including Yeremenko. Yet here, a withdrawal of maybe 3 to 5 kilometers to potentially prevent a couple of units being encircled or destroyed caused Yeremenko to sack Lopatin. By itself, it doesn't really make sense, which suggests that Yeremenko wasn't happy with Lopatin's overall performance, and we've seen hints of this in previous episodes. Therefore, this incident was probably just the excuse needed to get rid of him. And this obviously wasn't a good time for the 62nd Army to be leaderless. Not only were the Axis advancing towards Stalingrad, but they were also successfully resisting the Soviet relief effort to the north. Overnight, on the 7th to 8th of September, 3rd Motorized Division had regrouped. The 92nd Infantry Regiment of 60th Motorized Division was subordinated to the 3rd Motorized Division and now took over the Kuzmichi area. Because of this, the 8th Infantry Regiment was pulled out of the line and moved to where the 53rd Motorcycle Battalion was, relieving the battalion. The 53rd Motorcycle Battalion then moved behind the 92nd Infantry Regiment to act as the division's reserve, and the 103rd and 160th Panzer Battalions were also placed behind 8th Infantry Regiment to form a mobile reserve. So, when Zhukov's attacks continued, they went nowhere as usual. All enemy attacks were repulsed, but they did succeed in moving to within hand grenade range of the main battle line almost everywhere. Casualties were sustained though, with the 3rd Motorized Division losing exactly 100 men killed or wounded, and it was noted by the Germans that Soviet artillery was gradually becoming more and more powerful. Still, the line had held, unlike what was happening further south. The 295th Infantry Division forced back the 23rd Tank Corps and the 399th and 112th Rifle Divisions. And Krylov had to send in the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade and Kopka's 6th Tank Brigade to stabilise the situation. The 71st Infantry Division also pushed the few hundred remaining men of the 87th Rifle Division, the 42nd Rifle Brigade and the Northern Regiment of Afanaseyev's 244th Rifle Division back to the hospital and motor tractor station north of the Tsaritsa River. Further south, Kempf finally launched the attack he'd been preparing for over the last few days. At 03:30 hours, German artillery and Werfers opened up and Stukas flew overhead towards their targets. Leading the charge, Kampfgruppe Lankite struck Pashoshin's 131st Rifle and Glazkov's 35th Guards Rifle Divisions, who were supported by the 20th Destroyer Brigade, and cut through the seam between the 62nd and 64th Armies. To their north, Kampfgruppe Broik assaulted the 2 southern regiments of the 244th Rifle Division, rapidly overwhelming the Soviet forces. Afanaseyev watched as 2 of his battalions were completely wiped out in heavy fighting northwest of Stalingrad's Minina suburb. Fremery's 29th Motorized Division also moved southeast of Voropanovo Station, forcing the 204th and 126th Rifle Divisions and the reinforcing 138th Rifle Division and 133rd Tank Brigade back to the outskirts of Pashanka. The 343rd Rifle Regiment of the 138th Rifle Division was almost completely destroyed in the process. But then things started to go wrong for the Germans. Heavy Soviet fire hit Lankeet in the flank as they passed Yelshanka, and anti-tank guns opened up ahead of them. They took a hill in the area in the early morning, but quickly became embroiled in a tank and anti-tank fight. It appears the enemy has decided to hold out until the last. The soldiers of 35th Guards Division, manning the trenches and dugouts on the slopes, did not think to give up. Hand-to-hand fighting flashed everywhere. German tanks exploded, hit with anti-tank rifles and with Molotov cocktails. Glaskov's 35th Guards Rifle Division fought bitterly, counter-attacking the hill and retook it. Glaskov himself was killed on Hill 144.9, and Dubyansky, Glaskov's chief of staff, had to take over command of the division. Heim then reported to Kempf that the fighting was fierce and requested air support. Krylov had reacted by sending Colonel Draklov's 10th Rifle Brigade to the area to counter Broik's attack, which then stalled just before 0800 hours. And when it looked like the German panzers might break through to the south and might be able to link up with the Romanians, Shumilov reacted by withdrawing the 126th Rifle Division to protect the northern approaches to Bikitovka and form a reserve. With the German attack stalled, Hauenschelt gathered some of his officers to discuss what to do next. Lieutenant Hubertus Schultz recorded what happened. On hand was a spread-out map illustrating the planned attack of the divisional commander and the assembled officers of the 4th Motorcycle Battalion staff. Everyone was standing in a dugout, where there was constant calculated harassing fire from Russian artillery. Suddenly, a shell from a mortar, which as everyone knows cannot be heard approaching in contrast to an artillery shell, detonated right in the middle of the map. The effect was devastating. Hardly anyone survived. The general was severely wounded, and our commander, Rittmeister von der Gruben, was dead on the spot. Only I escaped the terror. When the shell exploded, I had just stooped down to pick up a pencil and was thrown against the dugout wall by the shell splinters. Hauenschelt was wounded so severely that he was unable to command his division anymore. Therefore, Colonel Broik temporarily took over command of the division as a replacement general was found. Colonel von Gruben, commander of 4th Motorcycle Battalion, was also killed and replaced by Rittmeister von Langen-Seinkeller. And several other officers were also wounded or killed as a result of this one mortar shell, and also had to be replaced. Nevertheless, 48th Panzer Corps continued to make gains throughout the day, although these gains were slight and came at a high cost. Massive Soviet artillery, anti-tank, mortar and rocket fire had devastated the division, with a total of 5 panzers lost completely and another 33 panzers damaged, all by 11 AM. The shortage of artillery ammunition added to their worries, as did the flanking fire coming from the 71st Infantry Division's area. Thus, the attack came to a halt and the Volga was not reached. 28 of 24th Panzer Division's 47 panzers had been knocked out, and 230 men of the division had become casualties, although many panzers were repairable and some of the men stayed with the troops. The point is, though, that this had been a terrible day for Kempf's men, even if they had equally caused a loss of casualties for the Soviet side. Still, the German command had other things to worry about. Führer has refused to issue an order when the Supreme Commander, who is incomprehensible and also may understand later, is convinced that he cannot organise a strong thrust by the 4th Mountain Division along the coast. He should leave it alone. Yes, it seems that there were leadership problems on both sides at this most critical point of the battle. On the 9th of September 1942, Zhukov's attacks continued once again, but did almost nothing except for make a couple of minor breaches in the line, which were easily eliminated. The Soviets took heavy losses, although it's not clear how many troops they lost, but Wittersheim's 14th Panzer Corps also sustained 476 casualties, mostly as a result of the northern attack. After this failure, Zhukov requested permission to withdraw the 4th and 16th Tank Corps to be rested and refitted. Stalin, though, said it was pointless to refit them, stating instead that the commanders of both these units were not up to scratch. Yeah, it doesn't bode well for these commanders. Previously, we said that Paulus had to make a choice. He could either continue the attack into the city, or assist Wittersheim's beleaguered forces in the north. Well, on the 9th of September, Paulus made that decision. He ordered Seylitz to wheel the left wing of his corps northeast in order to assist Wittersheim's southern flank. At the same time, Hott was to wheel southeastward, away from the city, to deal with the 64th Army's positions at Bikitovka. So, the main effort of the German attack on Stalingrad was being diverted to the flanks rather than directly against the city itself. This is obviously not good, and indicates that Zhukov's attacks were having an impact, and that Shumilov was causing trouble in the south. But at the very least, Hott's attack did have the potential to split the 64th Army from the 62nd, which would then make it easier for the Germans to take the city. Therefore, Yenneker's division struck at dawn, moving northeast towards Orlovka. They were met by stiff resistance, as the enemy, in Seylitz's words, tenaciously defended every single bunker. The 399th Rifle Division and the 23rd Tank Corps' 189th Tank Brigade were battered though, and Gorodichi fell to the 389th Infantry Division. It really did look as though the Germans would come up behind the Soviet divisions facing Wittersheim's forces in the north. If they did so, this could relieve a lot of pressure on Wittersheim and stop any chance of Zhukov from breaking through to the 62nd Army. The 516th Infantry Regiment captured the western section of Alexandrovka village from Yermolkin's 112th Rifle Division, with the Soviet commander reporting that he only had 82 riflemen left by the end of the day. The 517th and 518th Infantry Regiments also pushed east and overcame the defences of the 38th Motorised Rifle Brigade, what was left of Kazartsev's 87th Rifle Division, and the 6th Tank Brigade. That afternoon, 6th Tank Brigade did launch a counterattack, but it failed and the Soviets were thrown back. Kazartsev also reported that only 140 men of his division remained, which indicates just how depleted Soviet forces were at this time. The 71st Infantry Division also pushed forwards in an eastwardly direction, but in this case the 42nd Rifle Brigade and the Northern Regiment of Afanasseyev's 244th Rifle Division only gave ground slowly, which is why Hartmann barely went anywhere but sustained 98 casualties. Further south, 24th Panzer Division did capture a railway station from the 244th Rifle Division, but the 244th, reinforced by the 10th Rifle Brigade, launched a series of counterattacks to try and retake it. These counterattacks were repulsed with the help of Stukas, but the Panzer Division had sustained over 100 casualties in the process. The good news was that the workshops had somehow repaired a significant number of panzers, and the 36th Panzer Regiment was back up to 40 tanks by the morning, and the 24th Panzer Regiment had around 30. This allowed the Kampfgruppen of Heim's 14th Panzer Division, the 29th Motorized Division, and the Romanians to finally force the Soviets out of the Pashanka area. Overall, Shumilov's forces had contained the German assault short of the Volga, but it was clear that all his divisions were evaporating before his eyes. For Yeremenko then, the situation now looked critical. The Germans were threatening to split 62nd and 64th armies from each other to the south of Stalingrad, and there was still nobody in command of the 62nd Army during this crisis. Therefore, on Yeremenko's personal recommendation, Stalin decided to make General Chuikov the commander of the 62nd Army late on the 9th of September, with Krylov as his chief of staff. Even though he had previously been dismissed from command of the 64th Army, Chuikov had proven himself during the fighting in late July and August, and this was the primary reason Yeremenko recommended him for the position. Chuikov wasn't told yet about his appointment though, and wouldn't take up command for another 3 days due to the ongoing crisis in the area. So in the meantime, Krylov continued to lead the army. But at least a decision had been made on the matter. There were also command changes on the German side on this day. Hitler dismissed Army Group A's commander, Field Marshal List, as he had failed to keep the offensive going, and because he had fallen out with his generals, rather than appoint someone else to the role, Hitler appointed himself as commander of the army group. As Kershaw writes, he was now commander of the armed forces of one branch of those armed forces and of one group of that branch. This was clearly a bad move. There was no practical way that Hitler could lead an army group, let alone one that was so far away from his own headquarters in the eastern Ukraine. But Hitler also didn't feel like he could trust the Wehrmacht leadership anymore, which is why rumours started to float about saying that Keitel and Jodl were also to be dismissed, and there was one other person who was told his time was up. Field Marshal Keitel came to see me. List must resign. Hints of more changes in high posts, including mine. This is the last diary entry until the 15th of September, which is highly unusual for Halder's diaries. Either the pages have been subsequently lost, or Halder was extremely busy during this time dealing with the command crisis. Also interesting is that at some point on this day, Hitler gave orders for Army Group B's Don flank to be strengthened as much as possible and mined, because he expected strong enemy attacks from that direction this coming winter. Try to remember this as we move on, because this contradicts other accounts later that said Hitler didn't care about the Don flank, which he clearly did. After inspecting his forces at the front and seeing that there was no way that they would be able to break through the German lines, Zhukov informed Stalin on the 10th of September that further attacks by the same forces would be pointless and a waste of troops. He said that time was needed in order to regroup and prepare for a better attack later. In response, Stalin ordered Zhukov to continue the offensive. Now, no explanation is really given as to why Stalin decided to keep attacking, even though these attacks had no chance of succeeding on the tactical level. And this lack of explanation leads us to the conclusion that Stalin was actually a madman Stalin, who made decisions that were so insane that we can't fathom why. Whereas the reality was that these attacks were actually having an impact, even if they weren't moving the front line. On the German side of the wire, the 3rd Motorized Division was on its last legs, holding a sector that was 8 kilometers wide with just 750 men. These were in 2 battalions from the 29th Infantry Regiment plus another battalion from 8th Infantry Regiment. They did have a further 250 men in reserve, consisting of the remaining 3rd Battalion from 8th Infantry Regiment, but the division's strength was clearly sapped. Between the 25th of August and the 9th of September, the 3rd Motorized Division reported that it had lost 2,199 men in total, which is more than the men it had left. Schlomer reported to the 6th Army that he no longer had the forces available to conduct a counterattack, and that he had no choice but to use the 2 Panzer battalions, who were meant to be used as a reserve force, in the frontline positions. And while 60th Motorized Division had successfully repulsed all attacks this day, it had taken the division's last reserves to do this, and casualties were mounting. On this day, the division reported the loss of 1,743 men between the 24th of August and the 9th of September. Koloman also submitted a report to Wittersheim saying, as a consequence of the sustained overstrain, worrying signs of exhaustion are arising in a few places. The defensive strength of the division must be denoted as appreciably reduced. Reserves are not available. We've also just seen how Paulus had diverted forces away from a direct assault on the city to the flanks. If he could destroy the Orlovka salient, then the southern flank of Wittesheim's corps could be secured, and Wittesheim could concentrate all his forces to the northern line and hold on against Zhukov's attacks. So this was having an impact, even if it was indirectly. Yet, the explanation in Zhukov's account as to why Stalin wanted to keep the attack going is lacking, leading us to false conclusions. Stalin was clearly not happy with Zhukov's explanation about the situation and why his attacks had failed. He therefore summoned Zhukov to Moscow to explain himself. Prior to going, Zhukov and his commissar, Malenkov, wrote Stalin a message detailing exactly why the attacks had failed. Claiming that they were facing up to 8 German divisions, when in reality they faced 5, they admitted that their forces were suffering heavy losses and had basically taken no ground. However, they also said that they were having a significant impact on the defense of the city, which perhaps explains why Stalin insisted that they keep it going. Again, just like with the German generals, Zhukov is trying to pass the blame to Madman Stalin. And this doesn't work when you dive into the details and lay everything out on the map, which is why you should support the channel like these guys have and make future videos in this series and others possible. Links in the description, and to everyone who has supported the channel and made all this possible, thank you. Also, I think I should give a bit of a special highlight to this patron name in memoriam to Charles de Klerk, 1930 to 2020. The account was changed a couple of weeks back to this new name, so I wish the family well, including Michael from brave little Belgium. At dawn on the 10th of September 1942, the 51st Army Corps continued its advance on the city. By this point, Colonel Andrusienko had formed a battle group in the Orlovka region to resist the German attacks. This consisted of the 115th Rifle and 2nd Motorized Rifle Brigades, the composite regiment that had been the 196th Rifle Division which was moved to the area, and the 724th Rifle Regiment. Andrusienko's force was hit hard by Yenika's division, and Wutman's division also continued to push forwards towards Stalingrad, beating back several Soviet units. Hartmann's 71st Infantry Division continued to push the 42nd Rifle Brigade and the northern regiments of the 244th Rifle Division closer towards the city. The pressure of Zaylitz's corps was so much that it looked like the Soviet line would break. In fact, Kopka's 6th and Biestrich's 189th Tank Brigades had lost all their tanks by this point and were thrown in as infantry in a desperate attempt to stabilise the situation. Broik moved eastward early on the 10th of September and reached the eastern approaches to Minina by nightfall. Afanaseyev's 244th Rifle Division, which was defending the sector east of Sadovaya Station north of the Tsaritsa River, now had its left flank turned. This could obviously end up becoming a problem for the Soviets. Still, in the early hours, Soviet rocket and artillery fire rained down upon the Kampfgruppen in Heim's 14th Panzer Division, causing casualties. But this didn't stop them from engaging Pashoshin's 131st Rifle Division, which was compelled to fall back slightly to the area south of Minina. Interestingly, an armoured train was spotted firing at the Germans south of one of Stalingrad's railway stations, although it was quickly damaged by counter-artillery fire. And German reports also note that even though enemy battalions were down to a handful of men each, they were able to put up stiff resistance, mainly thanks to the copious amounts of artillery fire that could be called upon from the opposite side of the Volga. So, even at this stage, it was becoming apparent that the Soviets were building up a substantial artillery presence at Stalingrad, which would obviously cause the Germans trouble once they got into the city itself. Finally, the bulk of the 29th Motorized Division broke through the junction between the 62nd and 64th Armies, fighting in bitter house-to-house combat with the 35th Guards Rifle Division and the 20th Tank Destroyer Brigade, both of which fell back near Yelshanka. This allowed one battalion from the 71st Infantry Regiment of the 29th Motorized Division to reach the Volga on the southern side of the city, becoming the first German troops to do so. Spearhead on the Volga. Marvellous. This was a disaster for the Soviets. The 62nd Army was now cut off from the other armies around it and could only be supplied by ferries across the Volga. Worse, Shumilov didn't have sufficient reserves to mount a decent counterattack on this day, and after an immediate but feeble attempt to re-establish contact, his troops failed to break through. That evening though, a second attempt was made with units from both sides of the line. The 131st Rifle and 35th Guards Rifle Divisions struck south against the German battalion on the river, with the 126th Rifle Division also attempting once again to move north from the south. This time the German battalion was overrun and forced to withdraw, allowing the Soviet armies to temporarily re-establish contact. But it was obvious that this precarious situation couldn't last. The Soviets didn't have enough strength here to stop another German push, so it was clear that 62nd Army would be cut off from the 64th and thus would be isolated in Stalingrad. Encouraged by Seilitz's and Kempf's progress, and ignoring the desperate situation to the north with Wittersheim's corps, von Weichs now ordered 4th Panzer Army to reorganise its forces and mount an advance northeastward directly into the southern half of Stalingrad city. This is important to note because it wasn't just Paulus who was wanting to take the city, but his army group commander too. And it was clear that the attack on Stalingrad city would continue regardless of Zhukov's offensive. As a consequence of von Weich's wishes, Hott ordered Kempf to move his divisions into the southern part of Stalingrad the next day, with the aim of seizing the city piece by piece. And so we are on the eve of the first advance into the city of Stalingrad itself, with Hott's forces, not Paulus's, about to be the first into the city. As Chuikov noted, the period of bitter street fighting began. It's worth noting though that neither side was in a position to really fight this battle, with the total strength of 62nd Army's rifle divisions and brigades at this time, including guards, NKVD and motorised units, being just 48,360 men. As noted previously, their fresher rifle brigades were often a lot stronger than their rifle divisions, which is a testament to how terrible the fighting outside the city had been. It would take forever and a day to go through each unit in turn and say their strength, so I'm not going to do that. But Isayev provides a detailed list of unit strengths in his book, Stalingrad City on Fire, so I'd recommend that if you want a complete list. As a quick overview though, their strongest division was the 10th NKVD, which had 8,615 men. But this was an outlier. The next best division that they had was the 244th Rifle Division, which had just 3,685 men, and that was the second best division. It just gets worse from there, with most of their divisions hovering around 2,000 men, with some having less than 1,000. Falk also has a nice list of divisions for the strength of the 64th Army at this time, which had a total ration strength of 49,778 men, including all support units. In reality though, its rifle combat strength was around 29,000 men, with the divisions and brigades averaging somewhere around 1,700 men, some obviously being a lot more than this and others being a lot less. In total, for the whole of the southeastern front, the Soviets had around 115 tanks at their disposal, about a third of them being light models, and they had no air support to speak of. Not all of these tanks were in the 62nd Army either, so there was very little armour in the city to stop the Germans. It's no wonder then that Yeremenko decided that this would be a good time to move his headquarters across the Volga. Yeremenko's current headquarters at the Tsaritsa Gorge was under heavy fire, and this was supposedly the reason he asked Stalin for permission to withdraw. Stalin granted his request, and his men packed up their equipment and withdrew across the river. Not one step back indeed. By the morning of the 11th of September 1942, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had become bogged down in fighting outside the city of Stalingrad. The battalion from the 29th Motorized Division that had previously reached the Volga had been forced back about half a mile from the river, so fighting continued here throughout the day as units from the 131st Rifle and 35th Guards Rifle Divisions attempted to push the Germans back even further. By the evening, the 35th Guards Rifle Division was down to just 454 men. Heim's 14th Panzer Division drove forwards, with the Hassel Battalion leading the way. Hassel had the panzers of both the 36th Panzer Regiment and the 129th Panzer Battalion, yet only had the strength of a battalion, which just shows how depleted both divisions were at this time. It took them 2 attempts to take the area ahead of them, which was protected by Soviet anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. With the help of the 276 Infantry Regiments from the 94th Infantry Division, they took a nearby forest, compelling the Soviet units in the area to fall back slightly. Shumilov's divisions were in a sorry state at this point, but despite this, they had managed to halt the 14th Panzer Division, which was also in a sorry state. Broik spent the day consolidating positions and preparing for the next assault, but he also requested that the division's panzers be returned to him from 14th Panzer Division's control. Kempf agreed, saying they'd arrive the next day. So the sudden attack hadn't gotten very far, but things weren't much better to the north. Von Weichs was concerned by the Orlovka salient, since Jenneke's 389th Infantry Division was the only unit fighting to eradicate it, and it was currently bogged down. Paulus was therefore compelled to reinforce Jenneke's division, and so sent Kampfgruppe Starhill to reinforce Seilitz's corps. Starhill commanded the Luftwaffe battle group formed around the nucleus of his 99th Flak Regiment, and now moved into position on the left wing of the 389th Infantry Division. This move took pressure off Jenneke, which allowed him to reorientate his forces against the city of Stalingrad itself, rather than just on Orlovka. Paulus also turned responsibility for the Orlovka battle to Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps, which is an interesting move considering that Wietersheim was having trouble to the north. In fact, only 3 Panzer Grenadier battalions were left in the south, with the rest in the north. So, handing over responsibility for the Orlovka salient to Wietersheim shows that Paulus simply didn't have enough troops to go around. The fact that he was relying on Luftwaffe ground troops at this time to hold part of his line is pretty telling, as are the actions of 71st Infantry Division. The infantry had to regroup. They desperately needed a break. The youthful Oberst Roska, newly arrived at the division, was the only one to draw the logical conclusion. He disbanded 1 battalion and several companies, and formed 2 new, almost up-to-strength battalions, into which he incorporated the mounted platoon, telephonists, and pioneers. Prior to regrouping, the companies had already been below platoon strength. 24th Panzer Division also reported that its combat strength was 8,714 men, instead of the 15,401 men that it should have had. It was also down to just 16 tanks. By now, Kempf was already shuttling his corps' precious remaining tanks back and forth between 24th and 14th Panzer Divisions. It's clear that German units were already drained, which is why fierce resistance by depleted Soviet forces had slowed the advance to a crawl. Again, we still haven't actually reached the city yet, and so this doesn't bode well for the Germans. To the north, the Soviets struck against Wietersheim's corps once more, but Stuka attacks blunted their effort. Only 1 attack was able to get going properly, and this was repelled by the Germans at around midday. 1st Guards Army tried again in the afternoon, this time with infantry and tanks actually cooperating, but it was blocked with the help of the 103rd Panzer Battalion. Zhukov decided, with Stalin's backing, it should be noted, to order the withdrawal of the 2 tank corps behind the lines, at which point he then dismissed Pavelkin and Michelin. 94 new T-34s were brought in to reinforce the 2 corps, and new commanders were selected. Maslov took command of the 16th Tank Corps, whilst Kravchenko took command of the 4th Tank Corps. Zhukov also allowed the 7th Tank Corps to withdraw for rest and refit as well. Paulus and Hott, meanwhile, prepared their forces for what they thought would be the first and final assault on the city. Throughout the 11th of September, Hott shifted 4th Army Corps' 94th Infantry Division northwards from Bigitovka to provide infantry support for 48th Panzer Corps' attack, but due to delays, Pfeiffer only managed to relieve the 24th Panzer Division during the evening of the 11th of September. 24th Panzer Division was now ordered to attack into Stalingrad, and it began preparations to do so. An assault battle group, Kampfgruppe Edelsheim, was formed to lead the thrust into the city. Edelsheim was given all the flamethrowers from the Pioneer Battalion, some flak guns on half tracks, 2 88mm guns, and several self-propelled guns. Broik issued instructions saying, amongst other things, that lots of explosives and hand grenades were to be used, with corner houses to be eliminated first before the others, and that infantry should go in to begin with before tanks and other vehicles followed up. And it was now that Chuikov was summoned to see Yeremenko. The ferries across the Volga weren't working regularly, and he was delayed in the crossing. So, while he waited, he decided to visit some of the wounded in the area. What he discovered was that many of the wounded were lying out in the open, were not being fed properly or at all, and many had been given no water. The medical staff also told him that they hadn't slept in days and that they were constantly getting bombed. They were simply overwhelmed. The faces of the surgeon and the nurses are whiter than their gowns. I can see that everyone is exhausted from work and lack of sleep. Chuikov had seen a lot, but the sights he saw here really seemed to have affected him. I feel suffocated and have a nasty taste in my mouth. Leaving the hospital, I go and sit in my jeep and drive on. Chuikov managed to catch a ferry, and at midnight he reached the village of Yami, or what was left of the place. German artillery had destroyed it, and the wood from the buildings had been used by the troops for fuel. Chuikov made his way into the Southeastern Front's new HQ, which was underground nearby. And the question is, what orders would the front commander give him now at such a critical juncture? Well, we'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.